Good evening, everybody. We left off on page 372. Smith turned and walked back toward the wall, but then suddenly froze. Remaining under cover, Kerry tried desperately to keep Smith there, hoping that the SEALs were on their way. "You're being infiltrated," she yelled over the weapon's fire. "The Navy will block all your exits. There's no escape, Smith." Smith didn't turn around, but she did say, almost inaudibly over the sound of the splintering wood and weapons fire in the room, "There's always an escape, Lieutenant, and there's always a choice." Then she collapsed. Kerry was hit in the head with a wood splinter and ducked at the impact, covering her head with one arm as she stared, confused, at the bleeding form of Taylor Smith on the floor. The weapon's fire stopped suddenly, and Kerry came out slowly. She approached her enemy, gun still extended in her hand. She pointed it at the woman's head, but there was no activity in that brilliant mind. Kerry saw nothing but the disturbing sight of blood running down a forehead above unfeeling, gray eyes. Her enemy had been shot in the head. Still, she went to kick the electronic pad away from Smith's hand, just in case it was a trick, but was shocked when her boot went right through it. The image shimmered. It was a hologram. Chills ran down her spine, but she forced herself to move. They had, at a maximum, 2 minutes before the base began to explode. There was not enough time to swim back to the submersible. They would have to find the ROV that brought the tank here and take it out. She slung the weapon around her back and ran toward the file cabinet near the choice machines. She grabbed fistfuls of DNA vials and shoved them in her pockets, then ran back to the splintered and destroyed desk and extracted the USB drive. Then she ran out of the office. 2 bodies that looked an awful lot like they were in special ops suits, but were otherwise unrecognizable, lay on the ground right outside. Energy weapon wounds had marred their faces. Kirby was still struggling with one of Smith's guard nearby, and Kerry pulled her weapon again and fired one shot at the back of the grunt's head. He slumped forward, and Kirby jumped out of the way, looking up. "All Ramen is dead. So is Hanrich," he said briefly. "But the SEALs got to Smith. She was at the other end of the base." At some level, she realized that she had been used by the SEALs and the FBI alike, convinced that she was talking to the real Smith so they could distract the crime boss long enough to find her actual location. But there was no time to reflect on that. "The base is gonna go," Kerry said. Kirby didn't look surprised. 2 minutes? "I don't know, probably something like that. We need to get out of here. What's the plan?" "Her EMP took out our communications. We're flying solo," Kirby told her. "The plan before then was to get back to the cargo bay and swim out, but there isn't time." He began to run down the corridor. "I saw something on the map that might help us. Come on." She took her map out of her pocket as they ran, and handed it to Kirby. She could barely keep up with him, as he was sprinting at his maximum speed, barely guarding himself with his weapon. "This way," he said, and rounded a corner. She fired a well-aimed blast at a guard who had just then noticed their presence. They ran so quickly down the chrome corridor that the white, plastic-shielded lights looked like strobe lights to Kerry. Just then, her radio squawked to life. Apparently, Kirby's EMP theory was incorrect, because even if she had isolated the EMP to only affect their radios, devices that took damage due to such a weapon did not usually recover. Kerry put the earbud in her ear and heard Norman's voice loud and clear. "We've located the bomb. Does anyone read me?" Kerry nodded eagerly, as if Norman could see her. "This is O'Malley. What's it look like?" she asked, out of breath as they continued to run. "Black cube, approximately 10 centimeters, 1 white wire on what we're guessing is the count, numbers and unidentifiable characters, red wire on the blast cap, mechanical and remote, black wire for the antenna." "Mechanical?" Kerry asked, her hopes deflating. "And no loop signature," Norman said articulately. "Don't touch it," Kerry ordered. This was nothing like what Smith usually engineered. "Can you see our location on your map?" "Agent Kirby," one of the SEALs called on the radio. "You are to direct your team to the Southwest Aviation Bay. Does anyone on your team have flight experience?" Kerry raised an eyebrow. "Fly? Underwater?" "Affirmative," Kirby stated, and continued running. "We are Oscar Mike to the Southwest Aviation Bay. We have at least 1 team member with aviation experience." "Norman, move to the Northwest Aviation Bay now, and hitch a ride with the SEALs," Kirby ordered. "Roger," she stated briefly. and after that there was no more radio communication. They rounded one more corner and were there. Inside the massive aviation bay were two very large vehicles with turbines, underwater torpedoes, air-to-air missiles, rotors folded up against the back of two short, graceful-looking wings, and a very large fuselage. Inside, a sort of vestibule, there were 3 of these flying submarines, prepared to disembark. The guards seemed to have figured out what was going on, whether they were monitoring the comm channels or they had inside information, and had decided to bail on their boss. It was clear they no longer cared about the intruders on their base. Kirby did a lightning-fast head count, and it didn't calm Kiri's nerves that there were no guards or SEALs left. They were the last ones there, except for CIA operative Porter, who had just run in by himself. "Where's Henrik and all ramen?" the man asked, out of breath. Kirby's expression remained neutral as he shook his head. Porter wasn't as easily able to contain his mourning. Henrik had been a very close colleague. "We have to get the hell out of here," Kiri said urgently. "We're all getting in," she ordered, waving toward one of the flying submarines. Just then, they heard a loud thunder. It sounded worse than any torrential downpour she had ever been in, and Kiri knew the base was starting to collapse. The floor shook violently beneath them. "In!" she ordered again, unsealing the top with a button on the side that was labeled for that purpose, and supervising everyone piling in. "You going to fly this thing?" Porter asked her, taking a seat in the front of the 6-seater vehicle. "Me?" she asked. "I've never seen anything like it. Kirby has experience." "No, Lieutenant, you're up," Kirby said as she climbed in. He took a seat behind the pilot's seat and said, "I'll try to help, but you're the only one with flight experience here." "I flew surveillance planes," she protested, feeling a flutter of panic as she looked at the unfamiliar controls. She pressed a button that said Emergency Seal Cockpit, and the top slid down like an old F-15's cockpit. Another blast told Kiri that the door in front of them was not going to work. The power was out in this place, and the door wasn't mechanical. "We don't know how to power this thing up," she started, and then saw a keycard slot. It can't be that easy. She took the pass she had stolen from the dead guard and slid it through the slot. The plane sub came to life, but demanded a password. Porter took a keycard from his own suit and dove toward the front of the small craft. He slid his keycard in the slot and typed in a code. The plane sub was ready for flight. Kirby looked behind him in alarm as the corridor lit up. "We're about to combust here, Lieutenant. I'd suggest you get this thing—" "Buckle up!" she screamed as she pressed a button to fire an air-to-air missile and pulled back on the throttle simultaneously. They lurched forward and blasted through the shattered glass, Kiri taking the chance that, with the power down, the energy shielding she assumed Smith had installed would be down too. Thankfully, it was, or it never existed. They broke through and hit a wall of water. Kiri was thrown forward into the controls and smacked her head on the cockpit frame. She forced herself to concentrate. Warning alarms blared and the structural integrity of the plane sub started to buckle. They lurched in spurts toward the surface as Kiri held the yoke and throttle back, desperately trying to climb. Water began pouring in and the life support systems failed. Then they received some help as the entire underwater base combusted in one enormous explosion. The rush of displaced water pushed their stressed craft toward the surface. "We're going to make it!" she shouted over the roar of the water building up around their legs. "I'm blowing the ballast!" Kirby shouted and pressed a button, which sent them lurching a bit further toward the surface, but didn't do much for their speed. It was probable that the ballast tanks had already been ruptured. Kiri's display went completely blank as the plane sub's power died. They were running on pure momentum now, with no way to control their movement. "Get to the hatch!" she yelled, and struggled to stand amidst the lurching of the vehicle. Kirby steadied himself against the crumpling bulkhead and held one hand against the emergency hatch handle. They broke the surface. The plane went airborne for only a moment, but it was long enough for Kirby to throw open the hatch and jump out. The rush of water pushed Kiri back from the exit as it started to sink again, but Porter grabbed her by the vest and swam toward the opening. They struggled through it, and Kiri swam for her life. She almost didn't believe it when her head broke the surface and she took in a desperate gasp for oxygen. She coughed violently and began to tread water. She saw Kirby and Porter doing the same nearby. Her mind was reeling with the events of the last few moments. She barely processed the fact that the SEALs were now approaching on small, inflatable boats, and that the MS-119 was surfaced nearby. As the seconds ticked by, she seemed to become more and more aware of her surroundings. She spotted a helicopter hovering over, and coughed again. She unsuccessfully tried to rub the salt water from her eyes with one hand. There was a pursuit going on overhead, as helicopters in the distance chased outbound plane subs with guards, hoping for an escape. The plane sub created bubbles as it crumpled and sank, and the base's explosion created a disturbance in the water that was pushing some of the inflatable boats away from her. Finally, someone pulled her aboard a boat. Between the adrenaline rush and the impact her head had endured against the plane sub's frame, she didn't notice who had rescued her and her companions from the water. She felt someone's hands examining her, heard them asking her questions, but she couldn't focus until finally something seemed to click in her brain and she began to answer. "I'm okay," she said. "Tell me your name," the man ordered. She made eye contact. "Lieutenant Kerry O'Malley." "How are you feeling?" he asked, and began feeling her head, her neck, and then pushing her down on the boat. Someone else grabbed her head at that point, and she was staring up at the blue sky. She tried to get up, but they held her down as they undid her Spec Ops suit and vest. "Wait, I'm okay," she protested. "I'm okay. I just hit my head. I feel fine. A little disoriented, but fine." "We're going to examine you for injuries. Stay down for 5 minutes," the medic ordered, and Kerry obeyed as they did the standard check for obvious injuries, feeling up and down her arms, legs, and torso. "Some contusions and lacerations, but nothing more. Possible concussion. Breath sounds normal. You'll be fine," the medic concluded, and it was only once he moved away that Kerry suddenly remembered the DNA vials and USB drive. Her hands went abruptly to her pockets, and the fast motion brought the medic's attention back to her. "What's wrong? Talk to me," he demanded. My evidence. It's gone." "Did you take my evidence?" She realized she sounded disoriented, and tried the best she could to focus on her eyes and appear coherent. "There was nothing in your pockets but the standard gear, ma'am," he told her. They locked eyes for a moment, Kerry searching for sincerity, and the medic attempting to provide it. Finally, Kerry clenched her jaw in frustration and laid back down. Her mind raced through the possibilities of the continuance of this investigation, and she reached the unfortunate conclusion that unless someone else had collected evidence they were willing to share with the Chicago's crime lab, it was likely that what had transpired between her and Smith would stay in the depths of the Atlantic. We'll read more tomorrow.